in this exercise, we're going to do some stitching practice. So with this pattern piece, we're actually going to do, it says parallel lines with the back tack. That means we're going to sew straight lines, and every so often while we're sewing, we're going to use the reverse lever and do some back stitching. And then also we're going to cut another one for what we call parallel runs. And what we're going to do, like the parallel lines, we're going to sew lines, but instead of stopping and removing the fabric from the machine and then starting again, we're actually going to lift the presser foot and we're going to pivot across so many stitches and then pivot again and stitch back down the fabric. So we're never removing the fabric from the machine. And we need to cut 2 of these because I've got to have 1 of these for each of these samples. So now I've got my fabric and I'm going to lay this out single layer, and I'm going to cut 2. And I have a selvage on this side, and the rule is that my grain line, which is this arrow, is going to be parallel to my selvage. If you don't have a selvage, tug on the fabric in 2 different ways, and one way will have some give, and the other way will be very taut. It won't have any give at all. This would be your straight grain, the one with much less give. So that's how we know how to align our straight grain. And I'm going to come away from the selvage and away from the top raw edge here where that I've ripped the fabric. And I'm going to lay the pattern on the fabric, kind of checking underneath, is my grain line really lining up with that straight grain? So that looks pretty good, and I'm going to weight it with a couple of weights. And now I'll take my pencil and I'm going to mark the perimeter of the pattern. This is much quicker than pinning the pattern to the fabric and cutting it out. Then we don't have to deal with so many pins at once. Get this all marked at the perimeter. Once you've got the perimeter marked, come back and mark your notches. We will use these in a bit. Then, now that we're done with the first one, I can actually use this line, and I'm going to butt that pattern right on that line because it's the same cut line. Weight it, and then trace around the perimeter. And again, once you finish tracing the perimeter, come back and mark those notches. Now we've got that all traced. I'm going to cut it out. And I'm going to leave them 2 together while I actually cut around the perimeter of both. And now I'm going to separate the 2 pieces. So now I've got the 2 pieces. One is for the parallel lines with back tack, and one is for the parallel runs. So now I want to clip my notches. And then I want to mark the face side of the fabric. So I'm with my pen, I'm just going to mark some squiggly lines. This is now the face side of each of these. Now what we're going to do with these notches is we're actually going to fold the fabric on those notches. So we're folding it in half, and you can just finger press this down. Just press hard and rub across, and that will keep it folded. And I'll do that to the same thing to this other piece. At the notch, fold at the notches, finger press. You could press this with an iron if you would like. So now I have two separate pieces. So the parallel lines, we're going to sew the parallel lines on this one, and then on this one we're going to do the parallel runs where we stitch down, then we'll stitch over, and then we'll stitch up, and then we'll stitch over and stitch down and continue. So now we're ready to go to the machine. All right, so now we're going to sew on fabric. And for right now, we're just going to sew straight lines. And I have this piece that we cut out for our parallel lines, and I've folded it in half. 2 layers, it's better to sew on 2 layers of fabric than 1. And for the straight lines, we're just going to sew half of the width of this in basic straight lines. And there's no need to backstitch or anything at the beginning or the end, and we'll get more into that in a little bit later. But we're actually just going to use this cut edge as a guide, and we're going to use the presser foot as a guide. So we're first just going to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the presser foot right here on this side right here. So, and then for all of the subsequent stitching lines that we're going to sew, we're going to use that previous sewing line as a guide. Now for stitch length, even though we did our SPI, what I want you to do just for now is I want you to set your stitch dial on number 3. So I just set mine on to number 3. Now, since we've never put fabric in the machine before, this is the way I'd like you to do it for right now. So we're going to lift the presser foot, and when we insert the fabric underneath the presser foot, I want you to move the fabric past at least 1/4 inch past where the needle would go in. The reason I want you to do that is because if we put the fabric in like this, the needle is going to be going in without any fabric. And what happens when that happens is that the needle picks up the thread, but it doesn't have any fabric for the bobbin thread to attach to on the bottom, and it just ends up knotting up in the hole that's down here, and that's not good. So I want you to put the fabric past the needle about 1/4 inch, and again we're going to line up the fabric with the cut edge to the edge of the side of the presser foot. So we can put the presser foot down now, and I'm actually just going to hand turn the needle down into the fabric, and then make sure that your threads are behind the presser foot. And I'm just going to hold onto those threads as I start. And now I can start sewing. So just ease onto the foot lever and actually sew a straight line. We're going to watch this cut edge going right on the edge of the presser foot. And when we get close to the end here, we can stop about 1/4 inch before. Now the needle is in the down position. We can't take the fabric out like that, so we actually need to bring the needle all the way up to the top position. So I'm going to turn the crank so the needle is all the way up to the top and just about to come back down. So that looks good. So I'm going to lift the presser foot and I'm going to take this out. And I have my snips nearby so I can trim my threads as I go. So there we have our first stitch line on this piece of fabric. Now I'm going to repeat the process, but I'm going to use this stitch line and line it up here at the edge of the presser foot. Now this exercise is just to practice straight lines so you get the feel of how the machine reacts when you've got fabric in the machine. It also is teaching you how to sew straight lines based on a previous line. So let's try that again. I've got my fabric underneath the presser foot just past the needle. Right, my threads are behind the presser foot. I'm going to hold onto them, and then I'm going to put the needle down, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew. Watch this line. Make sure you're lining this line up right next to that presser foot. And I'm coming down to the bottom, so I'm going to slow down. That looks good enough. Make sure the needle comes all the way back up to the top. Lift the presser foot all the way up, and then you can pull your thread out. And I'm going to keep doing this, just repeating that process. And each time I get a little bit better. Try to go a little bit faster when you feel more comfortable. Try to stop right at that point. Challenge yourself each time you do these stitches. Another row. Keep repeating this process. I'm not going to speed this video up because I'm going to do this with you so you can see how many rows that I'm doing, so you can see that I'm actually doing the same exercise. So I don't want anyone to think that this is monotonous or boring. This is actually a very good exercise to practice how straight you can sew your lines and how even you can make your lines from each other. All right, so we'll just do a couple more stitch lines until we have about half of this filled up. This takes a lot of eye-hand coordination, and also not to mention foot coordination, because you're using your foot to press the pedal to get the machine to sew. I think I'm going to do one more of these basic straight stitches, and then we'll do something a little bit more challenging. All right, how do you feel about that? Do your lines look like these lines? So notice the consistency of the width that I've kept here, and the consistency of the line, the straightness of the line. Okay, let's try something a little bit more complicated or challenging. So we're going to sew a straight line, but every so often, I want you to try it 3 times. Every so often within that straight line, we're going to backstitch a few stitches. So you'll need to have your hand on your reverse lever. So we'll sew a little bit, we'll press the reverse lever, backstitch, then let go, go straight, backstitch, go straight, backstitch, and then go straight again until the end. So what that's going to help you practice is your backstitching while you're stitching. So it's another eye-hand coordination, but also you'll be able to feel how the machine reacts to that backstitching. So to start, just like you did before, get ready with your hand on the reverse lever. Go ahead and start sewing, and you're just going to have one hand here because your other hand is going to be on the reverse lever. So I'm going to start sewing and let backstitch, let go, and backstitch and let go, and backstitch and let go, and stop. How did you feel about that? Is that challenging? The challenge is not that you can backstitch, but the challenge is actually keeping your distance from the previous stitch line consistent. Now you don't have to backstitch in the same exact areas that you backstitched before, but your line does need to remain straight, and it does need to be consistent with the width. Let's try a few more. Okay, ready to go? One hand on this fabric, the other hand on your reverse lever, and I'm going to start right off with a backstitch. Few stitches, let go. I'm going a little bit faster. Backstitch. I'm going to do 4 on this one. Right? I got a little excited there. I did 4 different backstitch. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, and the consistency is still good. So let's try a few more of those. Is this feeling better? I think we've got room for 2 more rows of stitching. Okay, that one looks pretty good too. Needle down, ready to backstitch. So we're going to backstitch. And when you backstitch, you only need to backstitch 3 to 4 stitches. So remember, you're keeping an eye on your stitch line here, right up against that presser foot. Okay, I've got room here for 1 more row of stitching, so I'm going to do 1 more. Those were actually kind of fun. Well, I thought it was kind of fun. Okay, so last row, gonna backstitch, try going a little bit faster, backstitch, backstitch, and end. I got a little crazy at the end there. All right. So those are our parallel lines. We have basic straight stitching that we did for half of this, and the other half we did straight stitching with back stitching, and that's to get used to using our backstitch lever. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in assessment. Let's take this over to the iron really quick and press it nicely, and then I'll meet you at the assessment. Okay, so we're ready to do some more straight stitching, and we're going to do what's called parallel runs. And what's going to happen is we're going to actually sew straight down this piece, and when we come to the bottom, we're going to stop. We're not going to take the fabric out and cut the thread. We're going to put the needle down in the fabric, and we're going to pivot perpendicular. We're going to perpendicular stitch across a few stitches, and then we're going to pivot again, and then we're going to stitch back up to the top of the fabric, and we're going to continue that throughout the fabric. Now, as we did for the parallel lines, half of this is going to be straight stitching, and the other half is going to be straight with back tack. Okay, so we're going to start using this cut edge as our first guideline, and each of our stitch lines we're going to try to make it 1/4 of an inch apart. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of help. We can cheat a little bit by putting a mark at the bottom. We'll need to know where to cut over or pivot over. So I'm going to say a 1/2 inch from each of the bottom, from the bottom and the top. So I'm just going to draw a line down here on the bottom, or rather on each of the sides. So this is where I know that we're going to stop. So if I start here, I'm going to start up here, I'm going to stitch down, and then at this point I'm going to stop and I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to stitch over 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to pivot, and then I'm going to stitch back up to the other side. Okay, so let's begin just like we did with the parallel lines. Match the cut edge to the side of your presser foot, and we're going to put the needle in where we drew that mark. Don't need to backstitch at the beginning of this. We're just going to sew. So here we go. Now that we're getting used to the sewing machine, we can actually try sewing a little bit faster. So I'm coming up to this line, and I'm going to actually hand crank it down. There we are, right on that spot. So needle all the way down. Lift the presser foot, pivot. Now, what is 1/4 inch? Well, we can cheat a little bit if we want to, and we'll find out what that 1/4 inch is, right? Because if I mark it with my ruler, then we know where we're going to mark to, right? So I'm going to sew over to where this mark is, and I'm not sure you can really see that in the camera, so what I'll do is I'll mark it out a little bit further. So you can see it on the camera, but I can see it here in the machine. Now you could mark on this line. If this is 1/4 inch, then I could also mark a quarter inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, and so on, right? But I would also need to do that on this side. We'll do that when we come up back to the other side. So I'm going to sew, and I'm going to use the hand crank, and it looks like it's over, so I'm going to lift the fabric up and then put the needle down. And then I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to sew back up. Now you won't be able to see in the camera on this side, but I'm going to run this previous stitch line right on the edge of this presser foot, on the side of this side of the presser foot. And then I'm going to come back up, and I need to stop right at that line a little bit far. Okay, so if this is a 1/4 inch, right, like I did with the other ones, and I can put my ruler here and I can mark all the other 1/4 inches. And we could have done this before we started, but I really didn't think about it before then, because I really would like you to start thinking about what a 1/4 inch looks like. So this will actually help you. So I'm going to pivot this, and I'm going to stitch over a couple stitches. Right, that looks good. Maybe a little bit more. Did you see what I did? I turned it, and then I put the presser foot down, and it hides that stitching. So I need to put the needle a little bit more further over. So go back to the original, lift up the needle, and I'm actually just going to place that fabric where that needs to go. Then I can pivot, and we can see the stitch line on the outside of the presser foot. And I'm going to sew. Okay. So this is actually going to get you really familiar with your machine. And it looks like I was a little bit over on that one. This will actually get you very used to pivoting, which you will actually do a lot of in sewing. And how well you control your sewing speed between these two spots. I'm not going to speed this up, so if you think this is boring and it's okay for you to fast forward through this video, that's your choice, but I'm doing this with you so you can see that I'm doing these exercises as well, even though I'm an advanced sewer, even though I'm teaching you this class. I'm doing all of these beginning exercises as well, and I'll be grading my work during the assessment so you can see what you should be looking for in your work. Let's get over to this. We've hit about the halfway point. Let me get that one just a little bit closer right here. Okay, so since we've hit the halfway point, we've got all these with just basic straight lines. Now when we sew, we're going to do just like we did on the parallel lines. We're going to backstitch every so often. I'd like you to backstitch in 3 spots on your line. So I'm going to start sewing, pick a spot, backstitch, keep sewing, backstitch, backstitch, and then we can finish up this line back to the top. And then I'm going to pivot. And I'm going to sew over. There we go. Pivot. Now when you backstitch, you only need to backstitch for, 3 or 4 stitches. And just take your time to start with. Here I go, backstitch, I'm going to do 4 on this one, back stitch. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster. Back stitch, back stitch. You should try how that feels and how maybe if you get out of control when you go fast, that maybe that's something that you will need to practice. Go fast on this one again. How many times can I backstitch? I'm just practicing my backstitch now. Pivot. And I think this may be the last line that I do. And so I'm going to do the 3 again, backstitch, backstitch, backstitch. Oops. And bring that needle all the way up, and let's take this out. And clip these threads. And here is our parallel runs, right? Running over to the next one. How consistent do you think that looks? Do you like the back stitching? How straight are the lines? What I'd like you to do is just take this to your press mat, press it really quick, and then we'll be ready for assessment.